watching Beyond Markets. Welcome, I'm Esther Awuni. Many thanks for joining us. On the show today, we'll be assessing illicit financial flows and how it impacts Africa. As always, you can join the conversation with the hashtag Beyond Markets. And you can follow my Twitter handle too at Esther Awuni. Now, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development says that Africa is losing about $50 billion every year to illicit financial flows. Sneha Shah, Managing Director for Africa at Thomson Reuters, joins me from Johannesburg to discuss how this is impacting development across the continent. Plus more. Sneha, thank you for taking the time out to join us today. Now, the OECD puts the amount it costs Africa, that's illicit financial flows, at $50 billion, but other international agencies have said that they believe that this amount is way higher. What are your thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Esther. And it's actually a very serious issue. When you look at the cost of global financial crime, we've done some reports that suggest it's actually costing the global economy 3.5% of GDP, or $1.45 trillion. And so if you start looking at that and you think about Africa's place, whether it's 50 billion or slightly more, it's a significant amount of money that actually should be going into the economy that's being leaked out through financial crime.
Now, there are different faces to this in terms of how we define what these illicit financial flows are. There's, of course, corruption, corrupt activities, money laundering, there's drug trafficking, human trafficking. But one thing that caught my eye was from estimates by the Global Financial Integrity. They say that commercial transactions by multinational companies make up a whopping 60 to 65% of illicit outflows from Africa. Now, this is just, I suppose that's their own opinion. But what is it that you have discovered or you've seen as regards this, and how multinational companies or the private sector is actually also contributing to illicit flows in Africa?
Yeah, so we have a lot of data that shows what people are doing around the world, and we have a large business in our risk business that actually tracks data around financial crime activity around the world. And there's a couple of really interesting things we've noticed. One is the criminals are better connected than the people trying to fight them. And so what happens is the drug traffickers, the human traffickers, the money launderers are all using the same financial routes to get money across borders. And most of that is actually not brown paper bags across borders, which is what you immediately think when you think illicit flows. It's actually using the banking system, which is why the private sector plays quite a big role. And the other thing that we've noticed is actually that the amount of money recovered and the people who are fighting this crime are actually not being successful. So Europol estimates that only 1% of financial illegal activity in Europe is actually recovered. So even when it is prosecuted, only 1% of the proceeds are actually recovered, which is a big problem. And so this is what we're seeing, and we're seeing that actually it's time that the world has a different conversation, which is, yes, private sector has to play a bigger role in fighting, but actually there have to be more coalitions, because if they're super connected and the bad guys are super connected, we need to also be very well connected in order to fight it.
What about especially for the banking system now, what about penalties and the extent to which they have an impact on some of those banks or financial institutions that were seen to be complicit in some of this illicit financial flows? Now, I mean, I read a story of a particular big bank that was caught using one of its branches to channel drug money from a certain cartel in Mexico. And what the government of that country did was just to slam, it was a big fine, but the bank just came, they paid the money and they moved on, and they were caught again. So I'm just wondering, to what extent would you say that the level of penalties or the penalties available actually do stop or prevent some of these corporates from assisting illicit flows out of Africa?
So I think part of it is intentional, and I think absolutely penalties are part of this. I do think there have to be more severe penalties and more public penalties, but I do think a lot of what we see is not bad intention, but actually lack of information. So for example, when we did a research across all of our customers globally, less than 41% of our customers globally are actually screening their third parties. So it's not necessarily that they are trying to actively take part in bad things, it's just that they don't know where those things are happening. And I think this is where we have to say, actually, ignorance is no longer an excuse, and you need to be better informed, but also we need to work together. So banks, for example, can't keep up to date with every single piece of news out there. There's more than 11,000 sources they have to scan of news on a daily basis. And we scan for our customers 100 million websites on a daily basis just to help them keep up to date. But they need to use better technologies and they need to be better connected with each other. So for example, one of the things we're doing in South Africa is actually helping connect the banks through a common Know Your Customer platform where they can share information using our platform and stay up to date so that they don't each have to try and put the same effort into keeping up to date. So I think there are solutions to this lack of knowledge or lack of ability to keep up with the amount of data out in the world, but we do have to work together in a way that we've never really seen before.
Now, one big part of the financial illicit flows is tax evasion. Now, we know that there's so many countries in the world that serve as tax havens or tax shelters for individuals, corporations, even government officials. But let's quickly talk about, data on, we'll talk about that, but let's talk about data on illicit financial flows. What we hear is that, and I think you mentioned it earlier too, that it is very scanty, especially on tax, especially tax collection agencies and mining agencies or departments. These are said to be among some of the bodies that are most reluctant to share data. What do you see African countries doing about this to ensure that we do have data and just to get a good sense of how much of the extent of the leakage that we're seeing on the continent?
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that people think it's a victimless crime. So when you look at illicit financial flows, people see it as, oh, it's money, but they don't understand where that money should be going. And as you rightly mentioned, these criminals are not paying taxes. And so that's revenue lost to these governments. And so if you just look at, for example, I mentioned 1.45 trillion. It's a very profitable business for people to sort of get engaged in financial crime. And if you could bring 1.45 trillion back into the global economy, you could actually boost everything from education to healthcare to housing to employment, all of these things. And we've seen, for example, $1 billion, just 1 billion, right? Not even 1.45 trillion. $1 billion in Mexico would pay for 327,000 children to actually go to school. It would pay for 2,000 schools in India. This is where I think we can make a difference by educating citizens and by educating corporations and governments on actually what is the human cost of this money and what could you actually do with this money if you brought it back into the real economy.
Now, according to the OECD, one of the reasons why these illicit financial flows remain is because of the extent to which they are integrated into the local economies. And I saw one interesting comment from the Deputy Director of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Now, he said that in some cases, removing an illicit economy is tantamount to removing an important source of livelihood. I'm just thinking if that is the case in many cases, especially for the poorer African countries, how do those governments fight this?
Like I said before, it has to be in partnership because government's chasing GDP growth. So government wants to attract companies that want to come and invest in their country, but not necessarily put a lot of regulation around them to make sure they're doing the right thing. And so what you see is unwitting participation in human trafficking. And we've seen this before in, for example, mica mining. Mica is a very popular mineral that's used in car paint and makeup. And we've seen in India, and there's some places in Africa where they're using children in these mines. And we've done an investigation that showed that in one mine in 3 months, 7 children died in India. And the mica was actually being mined for 2 large car corporations. And so what we need to do is actually bring the awareness to the companies as much as the governments of this is not just about money. This is not just about making sure people have jobs. In some cases, your children are dying. And how do we make sure that the brands that are eventually buying this understand the human impact of the decisions they're making? And in the case that I just mentioned around the mica, once we put our report live, the companies in question actually changed their practices in terms of buying mica. And I think that's how you make the difference, is you start showing the real human face of this.
Back to the point on tax evasion, because there's a lot of, there's a lot to be said about tax evasion on the continent. Now, the OECD and the G20, they came together and partnered to facilitate the exchange of tax information, which is considered, obviously, to be one of the most efficient ways to facilitate or to fight, rather, tax evasion. Now, obviously, there hasn't been a lack of initiatives on the part of the African continent and even on the international scene. But what we know is that, I mean, certain concrete steps have been taken. There have been accords, and of course, there have been even declarations to ensuring that this is fought on all fronts. What would you say, for you, in your opinion, has been the most effective method so far, either done by the African continent through its leaders, the international community, or perhaps a concerted effort?
I'm seeing some really good examples in other emerging markets. I think in Africa, we've got a lot of willingness to work together. 94% of the people we talk to say they really want to do more information sharing in this space, whether it's government agencies or private sector. But in terms of mature sort of partnerships, what we've seen is in Hong Kong, for example, very, very good task force that came together to information share. There were 65 arrests in just a 4-month period, and they recovered 2 million Hong Kong dollars in just 4 months. In the UK, there was a task force that recovered £7 million in a similar period of time. And so where we're really starting to see the effectiveness is where you're seeing these joint task forces that have people from government agencies, but also private sector, because the private sector has a lot of data, which if shared correctly in the right format with these government agencies, could help the government agencies be a lot more effective in enforcing and recovering the money.
Now, while there's cooperation to a certain extent on the African continent, I do believe that many African countries or regions are fighting or taking a different approach to fighting illicit flows. When you look across the continent, based on what you've seen, based on your experience, what region or country would you say is making a major headway in terms of at least tackling these illicit flows?
So I think each country is taking on sort of corruption actually quite strongly in a way that I haven't seen in a while, which is really good. And I am seeing in most countries there's a willingness to engage private sector in this, which I think is very important. I know in South Africa, for example, that there's a big partnership with the World Economic Forum, which we're also part of, on something called the Partnership Against Corruption Initiative, where public and private sector individuals are coming across to actually work on a project in South Africa to address the root causes of corruption, but also then make sure that we've got all participants, whether it's private sector, public sector, or civil society, engaged in making it better. And these are the types of things that I think are really great. We're engaged in another initiative with Europol globally as well, and the World Economic Forum, to fight financial crime globally. And those types of initiatives where you can bring local agencies together with global bodies and really fight together are very strong. I know Kenya is also going on quite a significant anti-corruption drive, but a lot of that is internal. I would really advocate that wherever these countries are doing these internal measures, to start bringing in global bodies and private sector that can help them take it to another level.
All right, Sneha, we'll take a short break now. Thank you for your time so far. We'll come back and pick up from where we left off. I've been speaking to Sneha Shah, Managing Director for Africa at Thomson Reuters. We'll continue our discussion right after the break. To join us again. Welcome back to Beyond Markets. We're continuing our focus on illicit financial flows. Still with me is Sneha Shah, Managing Director for Africa at Thomson Reuters. Sneha, thank you for your time so far. Now, one economic expert has been quoted as saying that a boost in economic growth for Africa, unfortunately, also means an increase in illicit flows. We know that obviously many African countries are trying to mobilize domestic resources and, of course, trying to have better trade deals with partners within the continent and outside of the continent. But what we also hear is that in itself, that's trade deals, have also become a very lucrative and a very effective way of channeling or assisting illicit flows. What are your thoughts on that?
So I fundamentally disagree with the concept that economic growth has to come at a cost of corruption. I think that we have an opportunity in Africa to set our own destiny and to set our own fate, and to grow in a way that is actually sustainable and reduces corruption and creates more financial inclusion. And although that may seem like a pipe dream, there are people that are really helping do that today. There are some incredible startups that are working in the world of sort of technology for integrity. And in fact, Citi, the global bank, has been working with the World Economic Forum, and we're now part of this global platform that's trying to help bring startups from emerging markets, including Africa, to talk about how technology can actually change the trajectory. And so technology is helping drive economic growth, but without the cost. And I've got two examples here. One is from Nigeria. There's a company called Noltan, and what they're doing is they're actually bringing the blockchain to public transport to help reduce corruption on public transport in Nigeria. And it's a startup and it's very small right now, but the idea is very compelling. And if we get that right, that could really help empower citizens and drive economic growth. And in South Africa, there's a company called Air that's bringing the blockchain to the concept of cybersecurity. And so again, if we get this right, there's a possibility not just for Africa to drive our own economic growth, but actually to provide tools and solutions for the rest of the world to fight this scourge. Because corruption is absolutely not an African problem, it's a global problem. And we have an opportunity to change the course of economic growth in this continent.
Now, Sneha, I hear you, but that being said, what we hear now is that there's a lot of underpricing happening when it comes to trade deals on the continent. We hear of over-invoicing and transfer pricing, and it's been said often that Africa has very incompetent and weak transfer pricing regimes on the continent. What are your thoughts on that?
So we actually do a lot of work in this space to help make the regimes more robust. We have a lot of data that can help companies be more compliant, but also help agencies gather more revenue around this. And I think that that's the answer, is absolutely there's going to be issues where if there's an inequality of data or inequality of information, that people will try and take advantage of it. And so I think that what's incumbent on any company operating in Africa is to make sure that the data is there. And we're definitely there to help. And I think that many, many companies in this space are trying to do that. And so I see less and less of this issue of sort of underpricing or taking advantage of that sort of inequity of data. I see it actually, the gap is closing rather than widening.
Would you say that, especially on the part of African governments, that they're measuring the progress that they're making in terms of how, on the extent to which they're curbing and fighting illicit flows?
I don't think we're doing nearly enough across the governments in Africa. I think that governments are very well intentioned and are trying to do whatever they can. But the reality is technology is moving at a pace that many public sector sort of participants can't keep pace at without private sector cooperation. And I think that's why it's really important to go back to my original point that the private sector plays a big role, because this is where we can bring the technology, the data, some of the sort of the connectivity, the AI to actually bear to help government be more effective at fighting this.
What about civil society organizations? I mean, non-profit aid agencies, especially both local and international. Do you think that perhaps they should also weigh in more to put pressure perhaps on both the government and the corporate?
I think it's really amazing the power of social media platforms today. And this is the opportunity for Africa to really take on this big scourge in a different way. You see it in Kenya. Kenyans are probably some of the most active people on Twitter in the world. And they really call out when they see corruption, because corruption is not this nameless, faceless thing that happens in corporations. It's something that's happening in all of our daily lives. And unless we all stand up and fight it, it's not going to go away. So I'm very encouraged by the fact that a lot of Africans are now using social media platforms to call this out. I do think civil society can do more. And again, working together is where we're going to get scale. So these civil society organizations that are working in sort of NGOs or on social media or trying to self-organize, working together with government agencies and working together with private sector will be very effective. And I will go back to the World Economic Forum as a great forum that can actually bring all of those three together and under one auspice. And so there are those types of organizations. I think the AU is another organization that can do that. And it's about how do we work together with those bodies to bring everyone together.
Now, it's quite interesting how technology can work and how it can be put to use. Now, while we know that obviously there's the governments and private sector, you just mentioned social media, can use technology to fight this. On the other hand, those who perpetrate these crimes can also take advantage of the technology that's available now. And of course, we're seeing technology evolving and becoming even more sophisticated. And I'm thinking to myself, both sides can use technology to their advantage, and I guess it's who can probably use it better. And I'm just thinking for the criminal cartels, those who have made sure that this is deeply entrenched in the system, especially here in Africa, they could get better at it. Those are just my thoughts. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I come to work with a real sense of urgency around this every day. I think, it's very nice for us to talk about partnerships and us working together. But the reality is that, as I mentioned, the criminals are doing it and they're doing it better than us. And so you mentioned technology, there's Adobe Voco, there's Lyrebird, there's some very interesting technologies where you can alter, for example, what someone's saying on a video. There's this whole scourge of fake news, and those things are being used against sort of people and against society. And so unless we are taking the same sense of urgency around our partnerships and saying we are going to work together, we are going to create these coalitions, we are going to take action, it's not a nice to have, it's now an absolute necessity if we want our societies to grow, things aren't going to change. And so I think, I agree with you completely that the criminals are very advanced and they're seeing all these new technologies as a way to really grow faster and to get ahead of the law. And so we need to, and I mean we meaning government agencies, private sector, civil society, we need to be as focused and as urgent about our ability to work together to fight it.
Now, while it's possible that mid-level, mid-income, perhaps a little higher income African countries have a better chance at fighting this using technology, there are so many other smaller, poorer African countries who are also part of this illicit financial flows. And what the OECD says is that these countries, these categories of countries will need significant assistance, especially international assistance. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And what I'm finding, though, is that it's not about how rich or poor the country is. It's about how are they reaching out to international bodies and to private sector to actually get help. So if you look at Rwanda's story, it's such a phenomenal story of a country that didn't really have much when it started this international outreach. But if you look at how they've leveraged technology in everything from education to corruption, they've done an incredible job of actually bringing in the best of global brands and global technology and leveraging their own sort of people and their own capabilities to fight this. There's another example in the DRC. There's amazing work being done using artificial intelligence to help predict where logging and deforestation in the rainforest is going to start affecting communities. And so when we think about corruption, we don't necessarily think of deforestation, but actually those types of things are also helping to contribute to global financial crime and the sort of inequality in society. And this is where I think these technologies are more easily accessible than they've ever been before. There are more global players willing to help come in and solve these types of problems. And there is an openness within government that I'm seeing that hasn't been there to leverage these types of solutions in countries. So I think it's not so much about how rich or poor the country is, but actually how open the country is to sort of working together with the rest of the world to actually make this happen.
Now, there's a school of thought that says that those African countries that will be successful at this are those that will definitely have to start by looking inwards and looking at some of those root causes of some of these activities, poverty, income inequality. For you, what are your thoughts on how this, or the extent to which this will help those African countries that will be successful at their fights or in their fight against illicit flows?
Absolutely. So, we've been talking a lot about the big illicit flows that are happening through corporations, but I think you're absolutely right that while there's social inequality and why those gaps continue to widen, where you've got youth unemployment growing at ridiculous rates, and you've got now the fourth industrial revolution, and we don't have people equipped for even the current industrial revolution, forget the fourth one, and you have the levels of poverty, and you have all of these social issues. When you don't address that, you're really going to make your battle an uphill one for a long, long time. And so I think it's as incumbent on organizations to talk about fighting financial crime as it is to actually talk about what are we doing to build society in a just and sustainable way. And I think all corporations today are liable and responsible for not just looking at shareholder profit as their purpose, but actually looking at all stakeholders they serve in the community, whether it's the people that actually in the local communities that they work with, or actually maybe it's government agencies, or maybe it's NGOs, or maybe it's their own employees, but they need to look beyond shareholders as their purpose. And I do think that that's quite a compelling thing, especially for us in Africa, because we can't do this alone. We can't expect government to do everything, and corporations actually have more resources available to them than most governments. And if corporations are working together to solve the social gap, then all of us will lift together and rise together.
Okay, for those corporations that are in a position to actually help facilitate illicit flows, do you think that from a policy perspective, the government should go back to the drawing table and take a look at how some of these businesses, especially the big ones, the multinationals, how they do business, take a look at their tax records, and just how they are positioning themselves to either be on the good or the bad side in terms of how they're facilitating illicit flows, and come up with policies that could just help bring about better transparency in their operations?
I think there's absolutely a role for enforcement by government and for encouragement of people who are doing the right thing. I always feel that it's easier to drive good behavior by rewarding good behavior as opposed to fighting bad behavior. So I think governments should absolutely work on that. But I also think corporations need to be responsible to stakeholders. And where I think that the power sits is actually with citizens in a way that it hasn't sat before. Because today a citizen can actually take down an entire brand on social media if they find out that actually the brand's been doing something that isn't responsible. And so I think corporations are much more aware of this. And I do think that citizens and civil society can be held sort of much more in the light of, are they buying from corporations that are doing the right thing? We're doing a lot of work around this around the world. So for example, with our foundation, we actually do these awards called the Stop Slavery Awards, where we're rewarding companies that are trying to remove slavery from their supply chain. And so then consumers can get to see, actually these brands are actually trying to do something good in the world, and therefore we want to work with these brands. And I think the more we can drive these positive messages to show who's doing well, you will automatically encourage that type of behavior.
All right. Sneha, thank you so much for talking to us today. We appreciate your time. Thank you for being on the program. That was Sneha Shah, Managing Director for Africa at Thomson Reuters, looking at the impact of illicit flows on Africa. Well, that's it on Beyond Markets. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Remember, you can watch our previous episodes of the show on our website at cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Markets. And you can follow my Twitter handle too at Esther O. Awoni. For myself and the rest of the team, thank you for watching and have a great day.